So now that we are able to accelerate, let's now work on deceleration and braking. And I'm going to create a function here, and I'm going to call it decelerate. However, this function is going to receive an argument. I'm going to call it rate, and this is going to specify maybe how aggressively are we going to decelerate. Are we going to decelerate slowly, or maybe more aggressively when we brake? So let's have that, and let's add a condition here. So before doing anything, we need to check first if we are already stopped. If our playback rate is 0, we don't need to do anything. So let's check if our playback rate is equals to 0. Or if our animation is already paused, we also don't need to do anything. So let's check, let's check our playback rate or play state, make sure it is not equals to running. And if so, we are going to return and not continue with our function. Next, we need to actually decelerate. So we're going to loop through all of our animations. However, remember, we need to avoid the vibration animation from being affected. And therefore, for each animation, we're going to do actually the exact same thing that we've done here. Let's copy that from the accelerate function. We need to check for the animation name that it is not vibration. And of course, instead of increasing the playback rate, we're going to decrease it, and we're going to decrease it by the rate that we're going to pass in this function. And we still need to call handle speed in order to update the text in our speedometer. But now we need to call this function in two situations: when we brake and when we release the arrow button, the right arrow button. So in here, when we release the right arrow button, we need to keep calling this decelerate function in order to decelerate gradually. So in order to do that, we are going to need to have an interval. I'm going to define this interval here, and I'm going to call it decelerate interval. And I'm defining this here because we're going to need to clear it later. And then when we release the accelerate button, we need to keep calling the decelerate function in order to decelerate gradually, and therefore we need to put this in an interval so that we can call our decelerate function multiple times. And also by trial, I found out that maybe decelerating by a rate of 0.3 every half a second would be fine in our case. Let's store this interval in our decelerate interval variable, because as we mentioned, we're going to need to clear it later. So now what is going to happen is we're going to keep calling the decelerate function. However, at some point we need to stop, right? When we reach a certain point, we need to stop calling the decelerate function. And therefore, in here, in the decelerate function, I'm going to add a condition here. And this condition is going to be, if we reach 0.2 playback rate or less, we're going to clear our interval. So if our street animation dot playback rate has reached 0.2 or less, let's clear our interval to avoid calling the decelerate function again. So clear interval, decelerate interval. And also let's set the playback rate to 0 exactly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this loop. And in here, I'm going to set the playback rate to exactly 0 for all of our animations. Of course, except the vibration animation. So what should happen now if we are accelerating and then we release the accelerate button? We're going to call decelerate, and we're going to decrease the playback rate by 0.3 every half a second. However, at some point we need to stop. So if we reach a playback rate that is less than or equal 0.2, we're going to clear our interval to avoid calling the function again. And then we are going to stop by setting the playback rate to 0. Let's actually try that. Going in here, and let's try to accelerate. And let's release the button. As you can see, we're going to decelerate gradually until we completely stop. Now we need to work on braking, which is going to be pretty similar. However, we have some repetition here that we need to get rid of. So we are looping through our animations, multiple times here and setting the playback rate to something 3 times. So why don't we create a function to do so and then call this function. So I'm going to create a function, I'm going to call it update playback rate, and it's going to receive a rate here, and this is going to either decrement or increment the playback rate by this rate, or if we set this rate to 0, we're not going to increment or decrement, however we're going to set the playback rate to 0. So I'm going to actually copy one of these loops and put it here and just do some modifications. We're going to loop, we're going to check for vibration, we're going to call handle speed. However, in here, instead of setting the playback rate to this, I'm going to check if our rate is equals to 0. I'm going to check to set the playback rate to 0. However, if this rate is equals to something else, it can be a positive number or a negative number, we are going to increment or decrement the playback rate using plus equals, like so. By having this function, we can use it instead of having this loop here. Remember, in here we are incrementing by 0.1, so we can just remove all of that and pass 0.1 here. And similarly here, we are decrementing by a rate, so we can remove all of that and pass negative rate here. And in here, we are setting the playback rate to 0, so we can remove all of that and set the playback rate to 0, like so. And this should still be working exactly the same. Also, one important thing is if we are decelerating and then we accelerate it again, we need to clear this interval to avoid calling decelerate while we are accelerating. If we don't do so, if you are, I'm currently decelerating, if I try to accelerate, as you can see, it is not accelerating at the same rate because we are accelerating and decelerating at the same time, since we forgot to clear the interval when we accelerate again. So in the accelerate function, whenever we call the accelerate function, clear the decelerate interval. This maybe also declare this decelerate interval here, and this should do it. Finally, we need to work on breaking, and this is going to be very simple. We already have decelerate function that receives a rate. So when we break by clicking on arrow left, we're going to call decelerate with a slightly higher rate, let's say 0.5. And we don't need to do an interval or anything like that, because as long as we are holding the arrow left, this handle key down function is going to continuously run until we release the arrow left key, and therefore we're going to continue decelerating as long as we are clicking on the left arrow key, of course, until we reach a playback rate that is less than 0.2, then we are going to stop, and if we call decelerate again, it is not going to do anything since our playback, this is actually playback rate and not play state. So as long as our playback rate is 0, we are not going to do anything in this decelerate function. Let's now try all of that. I'm going to accelerate. I'm going to release the accelerate button to gradually decelerate, and then I'm going to accelerate again, and then I'm going to click and hold the left arrow button to brake, and as you can see, we are decelerating more aggressively until we completely stop. I think everything is looking fine, and I think maybe next we can work on doing a wheelie when we click on the W button. And sorry, after reviewing the code for this video, I realized I have a mistake here. When I call clear interval here, I forgot to pass the interval, which is decelerate interval. Sorry for that, and let's carry on in the next video.